Good glowing day, Adam's child. Welcome to this long-coming third installment of my sermons covering the full lore of ghouls through the Fallout series. I intended to combine Fallout 4 and 76 lore together, but with the upcoming Fallout 76 update that lets us play as ghouls, and the fact that Fallout 4 already has a ton of lore, 76 and the TV show will be their own videos. So let's crank up the rads and attract some ghouly friends while we take a deep look at what's new, what's interesting, and what's controversial about Fallout 4's ghoul lore. Fallout 3 had a real fascination with ghouls. Multiple NPCs were trying to study and understand them and their feral condition, although New Vegas was not nearly as interested in exploring this condition. Fallout 4 takes place 6 years after New Vegas, and now that we are on the East Coast again, we see increased interest in ghouls, with substantial lore additions and a very different ghoul design for both ferals and non-ferals. There is a lot to talk about, including some rather spicy and controversial bits, and you better bet your ghouly bottom that we're going to get into it. The Commonwealth is a fresh new setting, an almost blank slate to see what about ghouls is the same as past games, and what seems to be unique to this area. The Commonwealth has so many feral ghouls. It's not even close when comparing the feral ghoul population to all the other creatures in the game. Anyone that has played Fallout 4 may get a sense for this, but it wasn't until I mapped out and counted the populations of all creatures in the game that it really became apparent, and it's not even close. Why is the Commonwealth drowning in ghouls? Well, it may be related to the intense rad storms that are generated in the glowing sea and can roll over the rest of the Commonwealth, bringing holy, beautiful radiation in its wake. Perhaps unsurprisingly then, ghouls suffer from as much discrimination as anywhere else in the wasteland, although the Commonwealth was arguably one of the better places for ghouls that we have seen so far, at least for a bit of time. Where nearly every game, Fallout New Vegas excepted, had one large ghoul settlement. Due to being unwelcome among the general inhabitants of the wastes, the Commonwealth has only one small, recent ghoul-only settlement. Ghouls were not kept from joining the Minutemen in their settlements. Ghouls had been allowed to live in the area's largest settlement, Diamond City, for a time, and the second largest settlement, Good Neighbor, has no problem with them. Plenty can be found in that rough and tumble neighborhood. Diamond City was a safe place for ghouls to settle down until around 2282, when the Institute replaced a man that would run for mayor on the platform of only allowing humans in the city. The irony in that, ghouls were accused of being ugly, which sure, but is that a reason to hate someone? Really, most people were concerned about a ghoul going feral, especially since there is at least one recorded instance of a ghoul going feral and killing someone in the city. When this Mayor McDonough won, long-established ghoul residents and their families either fled or were kicked out by force, scattering anywhere that they could. Many of them died as a result. The wasteland is an unkind place, but some were able to travel north and establish one of the few tarberry farms in the Commonwealth, eking out a meager living away from humans that would do them any harm. The Vault-Tec sales rep that we meet in the game's introduction survived the Great War but ghoulified and has somehow beat the odds to survive until the year 2287 when we can encounter him in Good Neighbor. He tells us that life as a ghoul is hard and that with the exception of Good Neighbor, no community wants or tolerates ghouls. But the discrimination must not have been quite bad enough to make a ghoul-only settlement as long or storied as the likes of Necropolis, Gecko, or Underworld from previous games. The Brotherhood of Steel are newcomers to the Commonwealth and are possibly the most discriminatory of any group. They shoot ghouls on sight and even consider them an entirely different species, and some of the scribes will pay us to get blood samples from ghouls for research. Discrimination is bad, but that doesn't mean that there aren't some who have a soft spot for our shriveled little friends. We can flirt it up with Holly at the Slog, who does her best to cover up her ghoul smell with perfume, although the folks at Bethesda are cowards, because we can't even make it to first base with her. But that won't stop her from trying to land a smooth skin. Someone in the Brotherhood hit a home run though, since if we look through some medical files on the Pridwin, we see a report that concludes that a scribe got freaky with a ghoul. Discoloration, rash, pustules, and radioactive residue in the groin area confirms some sort of STD was contracted from a ghoul, and if the Brotherhood doesn't like ghouls, You should see what they think of ghoul fuckers. That's not the last of the sympathetic people in the Brotherhood. Initiate Clark has been stealing from the supply department to sneak down into the belly of the Boston airport to feed the ferals that he keeps down there. Clark had a ghoul friend at one time and harbors guilt for wiping out nearly all the ferals that used to infest the airport when the Brotherhood arrived. He thinks that if they are shown compassion, that the ferals may start to get some of their humanity back, and so he has been stealing food and giving it to them. Once again, the Brotherhood does not look kindly on this, and if we convince Clark to run away from any consequences, he can be found later in the wasteland running from an angry group of ferals that he tried to befriend. The newly introduced radstorms bear specific mentioning, as we may assume that the prevalence of ghouls and the kinds of ghouls we see in Fallout 4 may be connected to this unique phenomenon. In the Nuka World amusement park and resort, which was not directly targeted by bombs, on the day of the Great War, many people sought shelter from the aftermath of the Earth's fiery baptism in various parts of the park. Those that sheltered in the Kitty Kingdom would successfully build a community and build and bolster against attackers and raiders, but after a little bit of time, an intense and unusual storm blew in. Green lightning flashed across the sky, and even a tornado could be seen, and very quickly, everyone fell ill. They didn't know it at the time, but those that didn't die outright would start ghoulifying. Some would eventually no longer feel sick, but they had changed and been horribly disfigured, and some of them would start descending into madness due to what they would call the affliction. This affliction caused people to cease speaking. They would growl and shuffle around and would turn violent if someone tried to restrain them, and this awful condition would become the mission of some to try and cure. Seeing how one single radstorm, albeit pretty severe if there was a tornado, could turn an entire group of survivors either into ghouls or just outright kill them, think about how many ghouls are created after 200 years of these storms thundering across the Commonwealth. And could these intense storms be why we see so many unique kinds of ghouls? Being a ghoul is hard, no matter where or which game we are talking about. They stink, they lose bits of their body, they're ugly as sin, and can seemingly go feral at any moment. All very understandable reasons for people to feel unsafe. I mean, have you seen those guys? They are ugly. But they are ugly in a totally unique way, because ghouls, both feral and non-feral, look much different in Fallout 4 compared to all games before it. This is an interesting topic to delve into, but also the first of a few ghoul controversies introduced with Fallout 4. Ghouls look extremely decayed in the first Fallouts, often missing just entire chunks that expose their insides, and the moist ghouls in Fallout 3 and New Vegas showed complete loss of skin and cartilage, exposing muscle and viscera. Fallout 4 looked at both of those and decided it wanted none of that. Ghouls, both feral and lucid, appear more dried out. Their skin is desiccated, appearing dry and leathery, a big contrast with the often glistening, moist appearance of ghouls in Fallout 3. They look less decayed than other games, although their wizened and shrunken look definitely makes them look old, which is a well-known hallmark of ghouls. What has been established as a ghoul trademark now is the complete absence of a nose, but it's a bit more variable now than it was before. Some noses are somewhat decayed or worn off, some are mostly missing except for some tissue around the nasal cavity, and finally the last are more in line with previous games where the nose is missing entirely, and sometimes there's just a lovely crater on their face. Interestingly, the noses will often have blood running from them. Do ghouls normally ooze, or is this from an injury? Why the nose specifically is always missing is not clear. Other cartilage survives, like the ears, even though they're not perfect. The nose just never seems to stay on for very long, regardless of whether they are feral or not. Another noticeable facial change are the eyes, which have a number of different appearances. Although quite rare, the eyes can look completely normal, as in the case of Billy the Ghoul Kid, although they are very often red and bloodshot, which, my eyes are watering just looking at them. Or, and this is the most interesting to me, they can be completely black. Black eyes are most common with non-ferals, and this sounds gross, but perhaps this is an advanced form of the bloodshot eyes. It is possible all that blood collected in the eye and just got stuck there and blackened over time, leaving the entire thing black. All ferals have reflective or glowing eyes, giving them a very unnerving appearance in the dark. With how much radiation these things pack inside, perhaps that is all or part of the reason for the eyes glowing in the dark. If these yellow orbs in their heads are meant to represent just really reflective eyes, then it could be an indication of feral eyes adapting to work better in low light conditions, which is the reason why many nocturnal animals have what is called eye shimmer when illuminated in the real world. Another notable change from earlier games are their fingers, which are much sharper and intimidating than ever before, tipped with claw-like nails. These long, sharp nails, along with the dried-out appearance, reminds me of old legends of dead bodies having their nails continue to grow, which was eventually proven to be due to the skin drying out and contracting, making it look like the nails were getting longer. Fallout 4's desiccated approach to the ghouls, in lieu of a more decayed and gory representation seen in earlier games, has been criticized by some long-term fans who think that it is just too far removed from the original concept that was much closer to how zombies are portrayed in popular media. Fallout 4 ghouls look more like some desert mummies chasing us around, and arguably like a different kind of wasteland creature altogether. If we are to find an in-universe explanation for this, we may theorize that it is related to the local climate, since diverse groups of old ghouls that were alive in the pre-war, newer ghouls that ghoulified post-war, and even Norwegian and Chinese ghouls all look the same. So it couldn't be explained solely by genetics. Perhaps it could be explained by the unique rad storms that affect the whole region. I would like to hear your in-universe explanation for this new uniform look we see in the Commonwealth, but also remember that Appalachia to the south in Fallout 76 also has this dried out type of ghoul. What do you think of this new look? Do you like it? Are you upset at the change or prefer this new look? Or, do you just not care at all? Personally, I don't have an issue with the change, although I would appreciate some sort of in-world acknowledgement of the differences at least, if not an outright explanation. Perhaps the most apparent thing you'll notice upon your first encounter with ghouls in Fallout 4 is how much they like us. Because, oh boy, do they like us. Like previous games, ghouls like to hang out in groups. They are not commonly found in isolation, but one huge difference is that expired ghouls can be found laying all over the ground where they like to congregate. With no apparent injuries, we can only suppose that the ghoul condition, which causes decay, first of the body and then of the mind, advances to a point where they cannot function at all anymore and at long last come to a final rest. Be careful though, since among the dead ghouls strewn about the ground are live ones that are laying down, appearing to sleep. They will get up and immediately set upon the nearest moving or breathing thing, running forward with explosive speed. In Fallout 3 and New Vegas, ghouls tended to gather indoors, calling dark areas like DC's extensive metro tunnels their home and hunting grounds. In Fallout 4, there is a whole other type of location that is a much better indicator of whether you'll find ghouls or not. And those locations are graveyards. Big ones, small ones, it doesn't matter. If there's a graveyard, there's a good chance that there are ghouls that hang out in or around the tombstones. The Wildwood Cemetery is the best example, with a very large group of ghouls hanging out, always found with at least one glowing one. It's hard to believe ghouls would gather in places like this because they're good places to find prey, and the vast majority of graveyards are not radioactive at all, so there must be something else that draws ghouls to these places, which are very often pre-war, and they don't show any indication of recent post-war burials. So it's not like they're attracted here by the presence or smell of dead bodies. This isn't the first time ghouls are found in a graveyard though. In Fallout 3's Point Lookout DLC, a huge group of ghouls hang out at the Ark and Dove resting place. So, is there something otherworldly that draws them to these places of rest? Who or what do ghouls regard as enemies though? It certainly depends on whether we are talking of feral or non-feral ghouls, but let's look at the former in this case because they can be observed doing a number of interesting things. Where in previous games they more or less stood and walked around, now ghouls can be found, well, also standing around, but also laying motionless or crouched down close to the ground. We spoke already of how they seemingly ambush the player as they lie in some sort of hibernation state or something, but often they can be observed crouched over dead bodies. They will grab bits for feeding, whether that be a fresh human corpse, a fellow feral corpse, or even random pieces of meat or cram, apparently. Ghouls tend to not attack other ghouls, something observed by a non-feral ghoul named Theodore Collins, and is consistent with Fallout 3 and New Vegas, but there are notable exceptions. When we are companions with the only ghoul companion in the game, Hancock, he will come under attack from ferals just like we do. Additionally, Father Gabriel is a ghoulified priest in the Union's Hope Cathedral in Cambridge, and upon entering the church, we will see him come under attack by feral ghouls. That very same ghoul I mentioned that noticed that ferals don't attack non-ferals, Theodore Krupp, would ironically end up dead when he became annoyed with some feral family members, seeming to trigger them into attacking and killing him. A ghoul turned friendly with the ghoulish perk will fight other ferals, and that is the only time that we will see them fight. It seems under the right circumstances, ferals will indeed attack non-feral ghouls, most likely as a defensive response, as the lucid ghouls in the Kitty Kingdom found out when they tried to restrain their feral brethren. Some NPCs have noticed ferals generally don't attack non-feral ghouls like Trish, who is a key player for the Triggerman Chem trade, although she chalks up the lack of aggression between ferals and non-ferals because ghouls taste bad. I'm not really buying it because we often see ferals crouched, seemingly to feed on other dead ferals, but regardless, this apparent crouching and feeding idle animation, in addition to bloodied mouths and instant, unrelenting attacks on everything except cats, leads me to believe that ghouls will attack and kill nearly anything that is not them, from which they feed. Ghouls have been getting faster and faster with newer games. In the originals, they just shambled about. In Fallout 3, ghouls became quick enemies, but now they are faster and more reckless than ever. Not only do they bum rush you at the first opportunity, but they will leap the final several feet, launching themselves at you with sharp fingers and fanged mouths agape. They deal damage with swift, savage strikes, bites, and their leaping attack can make them particularly hard to aim at and get an accurate shot on, as do their jerky dodges and jukes when you start aiming at them. If their leap misses you though, they will roll and tumble, which is a great effect, before quickly picking themselves back up and attacking with unrelenting ferocity. You can really slow ghouls down by crippling their legs, or even firing at them with a high rate of fire weapon, which will cause them to try and dodge so much that they advance much more slowly. These sleeping or hibernating ghouls, not quite sure exactly what is going on, can be lying unseen until they are awakened by the sound of footsteps. And after a few encounters, you can always tell which ones are sleeping because of their pose, or often their lighting is just slightly different, which makes them stand out. Ghouls will also crawl in through windows, out from under rubble, up and over furniture, or through holes in the ceiling before immediately setting on us and attacking. Although I hesitate to call it an ambush, since their entrance is generally fairly slow and they're easy targets while they're climbing out from something, we can't exactly rule out that possibility. One last very interesting behavior that sets Fallout 4 ghouls apart is that they can seemingly live through and continue to attack even if they have their arms severed during combat. If they are missing both of their arms, they will still attack with their mouth. However, with one or more leg missing, they will fall to the ground completely unable to move, seemingly unable or unaware that they could crawl forward with their arms. But even if we get within striking range, they never attack. It's almost like their inability to run short-circuits some part of their brain, and it's also not like a legless attack was just not considered by Bethesda, since the Protectron robots have an animation to crawl and attack even without legs. Hands down, the most interesting of these dismemberments is that sometimes ghouls can even be missing the top half of their head, just above the mouth, and they are still able to attack us. While this is much less common, half-headed feral ghouls are just as dangerous as any other, indicating that a feral ghoul's brain is not important to it functioning. Examining one of these half-headless ghouls, it would appear the only part of the brain that would still be present would be the medulla oblongata, the part of the brain in charge of breathing, heartbeat, sleep-wake cycle, and blood pressure. If most of a feral's brain functions are no longer working, and that is what makes them mindless radiation murder machines, it can make sense that they could function with only the most basic parts of the brain that govern critical systems and nothing else. And the loss of limbs in general is completely in line with all previous games where it was constantly joked about, but never actually shown that ghouls can lose body parts. This new mechanic also definitely makes them more zombie-like in combat. Ghouls with missing limbs will be able to be reanimated by the radiation shockwave attack that the glowing one variants can emit, but a completely headless ghoul is, and always will be, a dead ghoul. One of the biggest questions surrounding ghouls that many both in-game and in the real world ask about, what actually determines who it is that will ghoulify? It is well established at this point that there is no ghoulification without radiation. Full stop. Radiation is absolutely essential, but why do some people get sick and die like absolute chumps, and others go down a whole different path that ends up with them alive, but looking and smelling like they're dead? To not bury the lead here, Fallout 4 does not answer that question, but we can look at clues from past games and see what additional information Fallout 4 adds to here. Fallout 3 set a precedent for drugs or treatments inducing ghoulification on purpose, with the Point Lookout DLC, where we meet Desmond Lockhart, who purposefully dosed himself with what would normally be lethal amounts of radiation. You know, if you don't have Adam's gift. And he successfully ghoulified himself to prolong his life and to get the ladies. Although I don't think that last part panned out very well. We have 2, possibly 3 instances of radiation treatments ghoulifying people on purpose or on accident. First is Eddie Winter, a pre-war crime boss that has a messy past and relationship with the detective Nick Valentine, whose personality was based off the real pre-war detective that was hunting Eddie down. Eddie had it on good authority that the end of the world was near, and in order to survive through the apocalypse, he underwent an experimental radiation treatment that he was told could mutate cells and theoretically make him immortal. According to him, he never felt sick. He ghoulified sometime before the Great War in 2077, and he has been chillin' as a literal villain in what can charitably be described as a basement studio apartment ever since. That is one patient, ugly mofo. John Hancock, actual name unknown, is one of my favorite companions because he's just a cool guy. The colonial era drip, the gravelly voice, and the laissez-faire attitude that can abruptly turn violent at the drop of a hat. Man, he's so cool. Hancock wasn't always mayor of Good Neighbor, nor was he always a ghoul, nor was he always called Hancock. All of this is part of a recent persona. When the synth that replaced his brother would come to be voted in as mayor of Diamond City and subsequently kicked out all the ghouls, Hancock grew angry and resentful at this injustice, which sent him into a tailspin. He would eventually end up slumming around and trying every chem he could get a hold of, and was just an average junkie until he found some sort of experimental radiation chem. Whether the chem was recreational or therapeutic, we have no idea. But we do know that this rare chem made Hancock soar like he had never before and led to his ghoulification. Another unknown person, only called the control subject, gradually irradiated herself up to 6 sieverts, which is a lethal dose, before taking an experimental radiation treatment. But unlucky for her, as her title would suggest, she was the control subject, and therefore the treatment was some sort of placebo and didn't help. She underwent the classic signs of ghoulification, necrosis and body parts decaying and falling off, before she consigned herself to death. But she seems to be the glowing one locked in the 3rd floor of the abandoned house with all the holotapes, and the whole area is now swarming with ghouls, possibly drawn to the glowing one's intense radiation. What is the through line for all these radiation chems or therapies? We don't know enough about Winter's or Hancock's chems, but we know the control subject was given a lethal amount of radiation, as was Desmond Lockhart in Fallout 3, so perhaps that is a clue. It was also hypothesized that there may be a genetic component, and if that is the case, then it would make sense that we would see closely related people that tend to ghoulify rather than just die like one of Adam's cursed. There are 3 notable families that ghoulified together: the Krupp family, who lived at Krupp Manor, whose family overwhelmingly ghoulified in the post-war, apparently in the span of a day and a night, and the Peabody family, who is only a family of 3, but Matt and Carol's son, Billy, ghoulified just like them. The Gibbons on the island in the Far Harbor DLC had 6 members all ghoulified together as well when their ventilation system failed. Although genes could very likely play some sort of role, I don't think Fallout 4 has sufficient evidence to show it is the determining factor. because more often than not, whole groups of unrelated people who were just close together at just the right time and place have a more consistent record of ghoulifying. This indicates that it's external factors more than anything that causes ghoulification. Perhaps it has something to do with the type of radiation, as the glitch terminal in Fallout 3 mentions, where Dr. Barrows seems to have identified a particular frequency within the range of gamma radiation to be the culprit. Such instances of large groups close together who do not share genetic relationships are as follows. The group of survivors we mentioned in the Kitty Kingdom who all got sick together and most of whom ghoulified, numbering in the dozens. The Vault Tech crew and construction workers in Vault 88 would go on to ghoulify when they would get trapped inside, unable to escape, and again this is a lot more than just 10 people. A group of pre-war Norwegians on a Norwegian transport ship that ran aground has about a dozen of them ghoulifying and surviving up until the events of Fallout 4. The ghouls in a marble quarry run by the Dunwhich Boars LLC are the result of dozens of workers ghoulifying and turning feral. The Chinese submarine, the Yangtze with its entire crew, all ghoulify together as well, with only the captain escaping feralization after their reactor started leaking due to a mine strike. The Suffolk County Charter School is the last good example of dozens of ghouls who we know originated from this location because they are all pink, having been dyed that unnatural color due to the pre-war humans at the school being forced to consume an experimental pink food paste. That is not even mentioning the inordinate number of our neighbors in Sanctuary that we can encounter ghoulified in the wastes. Mr. and Mrs. Donahue, Parker, Sumner, Washington, and Mrs. Rosa and her son. They're just all palling around the wasteland together looking for things to F up. It would be reasonable to guess that radstorms may be responsible for groups turning into ghouls, with some places having extra circumstances, maybe like the pink food paste at the Suffolk County Charter School, which had documented physiological and psychological effects on those who consumed it, or the Dunwich Boars location, which has occult influences. The second biggest question right after who turns into ghouls and why is, why do some ghouls turn feral while others don't? Again, we don't have good answers, but we have a number of thoughts or theories that are proposed by characters in the game. That same group in the Kitty Kingdom would end up with all but 2 people turning feral, Oswald and Rachel, who would decide together that they would find a cure for feralism, or what they called the affliction. In order to bolster the area's defenses from raiders who would attempt to take over the kid park and kill all the ghouls, they rigged up the pre-war misters that would have kept crowds of families cool in the summer to pump out radioactive mist. They figured since they are immune to radiation that it wouldn't do them any harm. But by the time only Oswald and Rachel were left unaffected, Rachel wondered if perhaps all the extra radiation exposure actually advanced the feralization. If that theory is true, then why is Oswald one of the last to go feral when he is a glowing one and the most radioactive of them all? Oswald is interesting because he performed as a magician in the pre-war, and now in the post-war, almost has a sort of magic now. He can irradiate at will, which he found out could heal his ghoul brethren of wounds, but it wouldn't cure feralization. Rachel's search for a cure would be in vain, and as she was trying to return to Oswald, she could feel herself starting to turn feral. She left a final holotape recording where she would abruptly stop and growl, holding back some increasingly uncontrollable impulse or urge that appeared to be taking over. This is the first time we've actually heard of someone going through the feralization process, as their mind slowly fades away into animalistic instinct. Theodore Krupp, who I mentioned earlier, was the only family member of his family to not turn feral, and in order to protect them, he had them locked away in the basement of their manor. He is convinced that his feral family members can be rehabilitated or re-educated to become non-feral, because he figures if he, a ghoul, can talk and act human, so could they. They just need a little nudge. Theodore was a bit silly, if I do say so myself, since some of his lessons involved teaching his feral family the difference between certain kinds of cutlery, like a salad fork and a regular fork. And he would ultimately die at the hands of his feral family when he became frustrated with and aggressive towards his Aunt Belinda. Everyone knows you don't mess with Aunt Belinda. Finally, a ghoul resident in the slog called Arlen Glass was a toy maker in the pre-war, who would ghoulify when he returned to his house in Cambridge, only to find it a giant crater. Stricken with grief at the loss of his family, he laid in the irradiated crater, and when he awoke sometime later, he was a ghoul. He, rightly or not, attributes his lack of ferality with keeping his mind busy and engaged, specifically with his passion of building toys and technology even 200 years later. Could there be something to that? Maybe, since keeping the brain constantly engaged and learning has been proposed as a way to help delay or mitigate dementia in the real world, so could this be something similar? It is worth noting that leaders, important people, and those with a constant purpose seem to survive without going feral more often. Although this could absolutely be some sort of survivorship bias, we don't know the story behind every single feral ghoul. For example, Oswald, we spoke of before, was a well-liked magician and turned into the leader of his band of survivors in the post-war, focused on protecting his people and park while holding out hope for a cure. Captain Zhao on the Yangtze submarine was the captain, the most senior leader on the ship, and again, he was the only non-feral. Bobby No-Nose is a ghoul and good neighbor who is constantly scheming to catch a big break. She's raiding vaults and breaking into valuable storehouses. Trish, the triggerman, is heavily involved in their chem production and trafficking, having set up the ghoul defense system at their hidden chem lab. Theodore Krupp was dedicated to rehabilitating his family. Tommy Lonergan runs his combat zone arena, always trying to make a quick buck and working with the Institute. Kent Connolly is so completely obsessed with comic book heroes that his ultimate wish is to bring them to life, like one of his favorites, the Silver Shroud. Eddie Winter is a crime boss waiting for the day when he will emerge. The Vault 88 Overseer was again the most senior person on site at the construction of Vault 88. Daisy, the merchant and good neighbor, loves to read. And Edward Deegan, who is the muscle for the Cabot family, has wholly dedicated himself to his job. Oh, hey, Edward, I was just, whoa. Wow, nice, Holy crap. Did you see that? He just destroyed those guys. Get this man a raise. That theory, though, gets absolutely nuked by what has to be one of the top 3 controversies of Fallout 4 lore, which is all thanks to one Billy the Kid and the 200 years he apparently spent in a fridge. Billy hardly needs an introduction, but I need to do it anyway for those that may not be up to speed on a 10-year-old game. Where to begin? Yes, here. At this destroyed house near a weirdly talkative fridge. A young boy named Billy will shout at us and ask us that we release him from this fridge, and upon doing so, his comments make it clear that everything looks completely different and all blown up, implying that he has been in this fridge since the Great War. How could he survive in that fridge with enough oxygen? Okay, maybe there's a vent or a hole, but how did he survive without water or food? He does mention eating the last of the pudding, but like, how long could that take you? How did he not go absolutely insane in a dark box, unable to stretch or move his body for 200 freaking years? And then he just pops out like he had been shoved in there only an hour ago. He wants to find his parents, which, like, that's understandable, but also the longest freaking shot ever. But if we don't sell him to a passing gunner, then we can indeed find his parents and his house, where they have lived off and on for the last 2 centuries. The whole thing is rather absurd. How did Billy survive? What are the chances his home and his parents survived this entire time as well? However, it is true that a ghoul surviving much longer than a human ever could without air, water, or food was shown in Fallout 2. Coffin Willie was such a smelly ghoul that he was buried alive in the Golgotha Cemetery nearby New Reno for what he estimates to be a few months. At the same time, in the first Fallout, the ghoul settlement of Necropolis would die without their water pump working, but I think there's a way to make kind of all of this work. Coffin Willie and Billy both had very specific and extreme circumstances that could have caused them to enter some sort of hibernation state. In this state, they could survive without much of anything, maybe just residual radiation alone, until they could be freed. This may be a long shot, but Fallout 4 shows us ghouls will lay down, seemingly motionless and sleeping, so I don't think this is a completely unreasonable explanation. These motionless ghouls can even be seen emerging from water, where they had been lying completely submerged, with apparently no ill effects due to a lack of oxygen. The simplest out-of-this-world explanation is that both Willie and Billy, are the two premier examples of ghouls surviving meme conditions both given nicknames for the name William? Well, the simplest out-of-universe explanation is that the developers thought these encounters would be funny, which they both kind of are, but we all couldn't help but freak the heck out when encountering Billy's quest. Interestingly, Billy's dad thinks that the whole family ghoulified due to their genes, which is hard to prove either way, but if you run across Billy on one of your playthroughs, the funniest thing to do is not sell him to the gunner, or even find his parents, or even sell him and then save him, although that one's pretty good. The best is to run around the Commonwealth with him in tow while he is screaming and hiding from every dangerous encounter and yelling that he hates us. Look at him run! Holy crap, he won't stop! Run, Billy, run! Kids these days, man. Billy is also important because he also contradicts another aspect of ghouls that was implied in Fallout 2. Billy hasn't aged at all, apparently. He is still a kid all these years later. While in Fallout 2, the ghoul Typhon will relate that he ghoulified when he was a kid because he was so young that he doesn't remember a time when he wasn't a ghoul. By the time we meet him in Fallout 2 though, he is definitely no longer a child, having grown and developed from a ghoul kid into a ghoul adult. Fallout 4 does have a few ghoul NPCs like Hancock or Holly that express that they do in fact age, but at a much slower rate than humans. And so this is definitely an instance of old lore being overwritten by new lore. One expansion of previous lore established in Fallout 3 that must be touched on is the connection between ghouls and the Dunwhich Borers LLC. In Fallout 3, the Dunwhich building was hands down the scariest building in the entire game. Dark and full of ghouls, we pick up holotapes detailing a journey by Jamie Palabras as he searched deeper and deeper to find his father, until he himself had gone mad by the ancient evil that lie in the basement. The Dunwich Borers location in Fallout 4 was already mentioned as a marble quarry, but much like the Dunwich building, this seems to be a facade. They weren't interested in profiting off the marble, they were looking for something else. They appeared to have found this something else, since they abruptly ceased operations upon finding an underwater shaft that led past a giant unblinking eye, an old skeleton, and eventually to an altar flanked by mini nukes, with one of the few truly unique weapons in the game, Krem's Tooth. Much like the Dunwich building, the tunnels of the quarry are absolutely infested with ghouls once you get past the raiders who are trying to strip the quarry of valuable metal. Sudden and short-lived quakes happen periodically, and strange flashbacks to some point in the past will occur, just like in the Dunwich building, and hordes of feral ghouls will use these flashbacks to ambush us in full fury. It isn't until the end of the quarry at the final chamber when we see the final vision, a group of people bent over with their hands behind their back and some sort of priest-like figure at an altar with a knife. Everyone's apparel is pre-war, and the knife and the way that they are all kneeling makes it look like they will all have their throats cut as some sort of sacrifice. How this is all connected is not entirely clear yet, but ghouls and likely radiation itself is tied to the occult, although we don't know how or why. Additionally, Lorenzo Cabot, a former pre-war archaeologist and explorer who found an ancient relic that prolonged his life and gave him incredible powers, can be released and encountered in the wasteland, randomly inspecting some ghouls that he killed. He can be heard musing, and interestingly, one of his lines, he is commenting on the radiation syndrome's ability to prolong life, much like his own crown, and then he says, surely an example of parallel development, or is it? We can't be certain what he is referring to here, but he seems to be drawing connections between ghoulification and whatever psyker-like powers his own crown bestows upon him. He is set on studying these ghouls, and although he does not yet know why people ghoulify, he says he's eager to collect data and find out. The last big addition to Ghoul lore, or really I should say the lore of Ghoulification, is that it is now completely confirmed that humans are not the only ones susceptible to it. Yao Guai ghouls were added with the Far Harbor DLC, being a sickly green color and a bit skinnier than other variants. The Yao Guai seems to struggle with this affliction since the ghoulified variants have much lower perception than even the base creature, even though they do have more health and do more damage. It is immune to radiation, but so are all the other Yao Guai, but it does not heal from radiation like normal ghouls. So could this mean that it's actually not real ghoulification and more of a description of its appearance? Yao Guai ghouls were hinted at in the Point Lookout DLC from Fallout 3, when a pre-war Russian bear named Ruska can still be found nearly 200 years later, and the hairless body and cloudy eyes of Fallout 3's Yao Guai could be argued to be ghoulish in appearance. The Nuka World DLC also introduced Ghoulrillas, captive zoo gorillas that have apparently mutated enough over time to be considered not a normal gorilla. I mean, they don't look that different. Ugh! What an Adam's name. Sorry about that. They have reddish, maybe rashed skin, and the fur seems less uniform for sure. They are not outright hostile, and they have adopted the jungle man Sito into their troop. It's worth pointing out that not only do they not recover health from radiation, but they're also not immune to radiation either, so their ghoul status really should be questioned. Bethesda probably just saw the chance to use the name Ghoulrilla and just went for it. The last ghoul creature is a legend that we can hear spoken of in the Commonwealth by a caravan guard at Bunker Hill, where she mentions her grandfather witnessed a giant ghoulified blue whale named Ol' Peg. Apparently this massive beast shows up now and then, and its enormous size and cacophony of noise is truly a fearsome sight. We never get to see such a beast unfortunately, but one consistent thing with all these ghoul animals is that they are mammals, which may mean that ghoulification can occur in mammals or at least warm-blooded species. No complete examination of ghoul lore in Fallout 4 can happen without looking at the many variants that Fallout 4 introduced, and there is a very impressive visual variety. Gone are the days of only 2 to 5 variants. Fallout 4 busts down the door with 11 different kinds, if we're being conservative. Let's take a look at each variant, going in ascending order of lethality, starting with the weakest and continuing on to the most dangerous, talking about the unique aspects of each one, although it bears mentioning that all of them share a few things in common. All have the ability to soak up Adam's holy radiation and regenerate any lost health, whether that means they were attacked by radiation weapons or a glowing one is irradiating nearby. Additionally, they all deal a bit of radiation damage upon a successful strike, which may be meager in isolation, but will add up quickly if you are swarmed and attacked on all sides. You will start to pile on the damage and simultaneously shrink your health pool from the constant irradiation, making for a nice 1-2 punch. For most, that's a problem, but for me, it's like an invigorating massage. Ah, that's nice. Their ability to soak up radiation makes radiation-based weaponry nearly impossible to use effectively against them, and a normal gamma gun will do nothing but heal ghouls when shot. The weakest, most pathetic type of ghoul is not your roommate, believe it or not, but just the bog-standard feral ghoul. Encountered only by low-level players, they have quite low health, armor, perception, and melee damage. Of course, they irradiate for 10 rads over 2 seconds, which is another change from earlier games where only glowing ones could deal radiation damage. They are always found with ragged, faded clothes, old worn dresses or shirts and pants that have seen better days. Many ghoul types share physical attributes like the jagged teeth, the puckered mouths flecked with blood, sharp claw-like fingers, small yellow pustules growing around their body, yellow gunk buildup around their eyes, and sometimes enlarged, sagging throats. The weirdly bloated throats almost remind me of the goiters that develop on people with iodine deficiency that causes their thyroid to swell. Interestingly though, iodine is often used as a preventative medicine in case of radioactive exposure, since loading up on iodine will prevent radioactive iodine-131 from being absorbed by the thyroid and potentially causing harm to all you filthy radiation casuals. Most ghouls are also hunched so far forward that their spine protrudes very prominently, to the point that individual vertebrae stick out almost like small spines. Their hunched posture may be related to their exceptionally long lifespans. Normally, people will start to hunch in their old age as their muscles age and weaken and their spinal discs wear out, which may be exactly what we see with the ferals. We see a similar variant on the island that we visit in the Far Harbor DLC that are known to the locals as fog ghouls. They are the same stat-wise as the basic feral ghoul, but physically differ in some ways. They are often draped or clad in fishing nets, and not the sexy kind, with pale skin and parts covered in something dark like soot or maybe mud. The fog ghouls seem to owe their transformation to Adam's wholly irradiated fog that blankets this island. How they've become covered in netting isn't clear, although perhaps they get tangled in all sorts of fishing equipment and detritus that washes up or has been abandoned as they wander along beaches looking for prey. A completely unexpected ghoul type that is similar stat-wise to the lowest level feral ghouls are pink feral ghouls that had feasted or maybe still do feast on pink food paste at the Suffolk County Charter School. They inflict a bit more damage but have lower perception, but are as fragile as ever, and it isn't clear if the paste served a role in the ghoulification of those that consumed it. This is one of the only low-level variants that are very rarely seen wearing clothes. Most of them are completely naked. This is where we yet again confirm that there is, in fact, no junk inside those trunks, and these shriveled babies do not have back. I'm sure some of you are absolutely devastated by this. Feral ghoul roamers make another appearance after first being seen in Fallout 3 and New Vegas and are about double the threat of normal ferals. They look nearly identical, although the roamers commonly have shorter and more tattered clothes, which could indicate that they may have been feral for longer than common feral ghouls. Roamers are also interesting because their skin can range in many colors, from tan to gray. Feral ghoul stalkers don't look much different from roamers, although they will often act as low-level mini-bosses in locations populated by ghouls. One of the best ways to identify this type physically is by looking at their face, as they often have reddish-pink eyes and a gaping bloody mouth, likely the bloody remains of their last meal, or possibly their own blood from flying face first into their last victim. Another completely unique type of ghoul was introduced in the Nuka World add-on, and boy, are they colorful. Painted ghouls are a group that can be found in the Kitty Kingdom Park, painted bright colors by our pal Oswald the Outrageous, in a bid to make them a little bit more terrifying. They come in a variety of colors, with paint usually just splattered around, but sometimes very deliberately painted on their face. I think Oswald just gets a little bored sometimes. Painted ghouls are also often seen with blood on their hands, legs, and feet, seeming evidence of their effectiveness at keeping the Nuka World raiders out of the park. I do love getting these guys stuck on the spinny rides because their AI just completely glitches out. Whee! Leaving Nuka World and getting back to non-unique types, feral ghoul reavers are on the same exact level as the painted ghouls, and they're the first type in Fallout 4 to be seen clad in armor. This weathered, partially destroyed armor appears to be old metal armor, likely indicating that these are post-war ghouls, since metal armor was probably not widespread in the pre-war. These unfortunate souls who are lucky enough to get sturdy post-war armor were not lucky enough to avoid ghoulification. It is possible that reavers are more lethal because of their partial protection that the armor can still offer, but Fallout 4's reavers are more like New Vegas, and not the insane ranged bullet sponges from Fallout 3 that still give me nightmares. Now we get into the more difficult half of the new variants. Often one of these will be found amongst a group of ghouls, acting like a mini-boss. The weakest of this group is the withered feral ghoul, who begins to appear around level 30 because they have more health and do more damage than anything else we've mentioned so far, and will do an additional 20 poison damage for 4 seconds, indicated by the on-screen sickly yellow texture. This seems to indicate that these ghouls have a disease or form of sepsis as a result of their slow decay, and that is what is poisoning us when we get hit. Withered ghouls look how they sound like they should look. They are as skinny as your average YouTube lore tuber, are a grayish green color, lack any clothing, and appear particularly dried out, which, let's face it, is impressive with how dried out all the ghouls already look, and their mouths are pulled taut against their face by their withered exterior. I do wonder though, why do withered ghouls have better stats over, say, the armored ghoul reaver? Withered honestly makes it sound like they are older or more frail. I don't necessarily associate withered with being more dangerous. If you have any idea why a very dried out ghoul could be a more dangerous type, I'd love to hear it. We are entering gross territory now. Well, you know, ghouls have always been gross, but these are the nastiest types Fallout 4 has to offer. Gangrenous feral ghouls are barely more dangerous than withered ghouls. They will inflict poison damage in addition to physical and radiation damage. They are the greenest of the non-glowing variants, likely a result of the gangrene that they are named after, meaning that they are very actively decaying. Of course, we know decay is part of what makes a ghoul, but in Fallout 4 this is the first that just really sells that idea. Gangrenous feral ghouls have the most ragged clothes, if we even want to call it that. Often it's just strips of cloth wrapped around their forearms, legs, or feet, although sometimes they can be found wearing tattered clothing. Some gangrenous ghouls are also more gaunt than even the withered variety, with their rib cage jutting out in dramatic fashion. Finally, one of the longest standing types in the entire series, the glowing ones, make their appearance. Glowing ones have a tremendous amount of health, and just getting close to one will dose you with 10 rads. They may not have the pure raw damage of the gangrenous or even withered ghouls, but their radiation shockwave attack can be much more dangerous. During their radiation burst, which is reminiscent of the glowing ones in Fallout 3, they seem to charge up and blast out radiation in a medium-sized radius around them, and this radiation will heal any injured ghouls nearby and can even resurrect ghouls that were previously dead. This turns one moderate threat into many when fighting in a group, and makes glowing ones priority targets so that you don't have to waste ammo putting ghouls down only to have them heal and resurrect. Glowing ghouls seem to have hotspots. The glow is not consistent over their entire body, with the hotspots being in the torso or the back, and always on the eyes. These must be centers of radiation. Speaking of the eyes, they appear swollen, nearly shut, and glowing ones have black teeth set against their glowing mouths, making for a very menacing look. Unlike all other previous ghouls, they don't even have wisps of hair on their bodies. A glowing one's light pulses rhythmically and is brightest while they are alive, although they still glow and pulse when they're dead. Their green glow seems to come from their blood. As glowing ones are the only ghouls with green blood, the rest bleed red. They will also consistently drop irradiated blood and nuclear material upon their death, which is truly no surprise. Rotting feral ghouls are pretty easy to pick out because of their pale white-gray skin that is splotched with a dirty red color, areas that are apparently rotting straight off their bodies. Given this, one would expect them to do poison damage like the withered and gangrenous, but that's not the case. They just do a lot more physical and radiation damage than any other variants. Physically, they also appear to have different parts of their body large and bloated, certainly an indication of rampant bacterial-fueled decay. This is usually shown as enlarged arms and legs, but also swollen eyes, bloated foreheads, and recessed mouths and chins, making for a disgusting and lethal enemy that somehow doesn't deal poison damage, but it probably should. Very similar stat-wise to the rotting ghouls are a variation of the painted ghouls that are a little toasty. Charred painted ghouls do not share the same swollen body type of the normal charred ghouls. Rather, they look extremely similar to rotting ghouls. They are only found in Kitty Kingdom with all the other painted ghouls and are once again covered in splatters of bright paint. Although these are a charred ghoul type, which we will see later, they're much weaker than the unpainted versions for whatever reason. Putrid glowing ones are a special type of glowing one that is even more powerful, and it's easily discernible by the large tumors and growths all over their bodies. These growths are glowing hotspots found in their feet, arms, shoulders, knees, back, and left side of their face, and seem to be where the radiation is most highly concentrated. Near the top of the ghoul hierarchy are the charred feral ghouls, ones that spent a little bit too much time in Adam's oven. Unsurprisingly, their skin is a dark brown or black, but what is kind of unexpected is that they're all very swollen, with thick limbs, bulging shoulders, and barrel chests. I find this bloated body type intriguing to think about. Do these ghouls uncontrollably build up layers when they are burned? Some sort of out-of-control regenerative response? Or do they expand upon being burned like a burning marshmallow at a campfire? Something would need to account for why all the charred ghouls are consistently large and swollen when compared to many other types. Charred or burned ghouls are actually not new to the series though. In Fallout 2, ghouls had been described as burned, scorched, or one could even say charred, although it was in the context of those caught in a nuclear blast. And now the single most dangerous of all ghoul variants with the most health, the most damage, and all the abilities of glowing ones, the bloated glowing ones. I can't believe Bethesda put my ex-girlfriend in the game. The bloated glowing ones are easy to spot because, as their name implies, their bodies have begun to bloat and swell to proportions we have not seen in any variant yet. This is in addition to the glowing green tumors that grow all over their body, usually concentrating on the back and belly of these beasts. The hotspots glow brighter than any glowing one we have seen yet, and this may help serve as a warning to those nearby to steer clear or risk getting bum rushed by one pissed off nasty mama. Bloated glowing ones will often be the mini-boss of high-level ghoul-dominated areas and are an absolute tank if you are not properly equipped to deal with its massive health, incredibly deadly quick strikes, and its ability to heal and revitalize dead ghouls. The addition of these swollen or bloated ghouls is new to the series. Before, ghouls had always been gaunt as they lost skin, cartilage, and eventually body parts, but I think bloating can make sense in certain circumstances. To have some ghoul bodies bloat as they decay or become rotting and gangrenous makes sense, and they could pass along diseases since such a thing is common for dead and decaying bodies in the real world. To summarize the big changes Fallout 4 introduced, ghouls look a lot more different than ever, having a more shriveled and desiccated look, while also introducing bloated types with enormous tumors. Ghouls can have completely black eyes like some animals, they can lose limbs in combat, and even the top half of their head while still functioning and being a threat. However, their legs will completely immobilize them. Ferals can and will sleep or hibernate, waking up when they sense prey, and they can even hibernate completely underwater. This apparent lack of a need for life-critical resources like oxygen, food, or water was confirmed by Billy the Ghoul Kid and how he could survive completely isolated for 200 years. Although again, he admitted to eating the pudding. Naughty Billy. They love to hang out in graveyards now for some reason, and their connection to the Dunwhich Borer Company and their occult pursuits was strengthened even further. Lastly, we have seen the first confirmed instances of non-human ghoulification in bears, gorillas, and apparently blue whales, seeming to indicate that ghoulification may be a condition that only affects mammals. And that is where we will leave things, while we wait for the new Ghoul update in Fallout 76, so we can see how Bethesda is wanting to further expand Ghoul lore, and I am looking forward to running around and ghouling it up for the first time ever, since being a ghoul has been a pretty common request from players for a while. Thank you for staying with me this entire video. If you liked it, then let me know whatever way that you prefer. A huge thank you to all supporters on YouTube and Patreon, all these glowing people you see on screen right now who make it possible for me to do what I do, and I'm incredibly thankful for their support. And if you want to join Adam's army, then you can do so on Patreon or YouTube memberships. As always, a special thank you to my top tier, all to Atom patrons, Acrid B, Gardner Minshew Simp, Dommy Double, Tapey Papey, Juan Vader, The Breadman, Tyler Eaton, Owen Balzer, Ann94, Tessa Storm, Unky Nick, TSK Lego, Shallowfire13, Nathaniel Jolling, Tater Anus, and Ace Jacobs. Adam is pleased. Take care of yourselves. You are one of Adam's children after all. Walk in his holy glow, and I'll see you soon.